definition of what is functional, again, would vary from individual to individual. And so I would tell most people this. Number one, start with being self-aware enough to know what you're trying to achieve. Before you drop money on training of any sort, just figure out what you want to achieve. What do you really like? What really inside you is making you want to do this?
What's going on, Savage Nation? CJ here, back with another Savage Talk podcast, and this is the fitness podcast where we leave it all out there on the table and we get into relevant and trending issues within the fitness community. This is the fourth installment, and on this one I got my good buddy Dylan here, who I highly respect actually as a fitness professional, though it's not his full-time.
Oh, wow. I got some respect there, man. All right.
Yeah, well, so before I actually go any further, and obviously I did a generalized introduction, but why don't you give everybody a little bit of background on yourself and kind of, parallel that to how you're relevant within a fitness conversation?
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, I guess it kind of, for me, my fitness journey started when I was in high school, I suppose, and I was kind of a late bloomer, but late in high school, I just realized, I wanted to get jacked. And so I started hitting the weight room, and that became what would be probably a 12-year-long obsession over all things fitness. And so I got my personal training certification. I've done just about every different type of competition event that you can think of, and I trained for a long time. And right now I'm at a point where I'm kind of transitioning, but I'll never leave the fitness concept and the fitness ideals that I've learned behind. So while I'm working on starting a new company that's not 100% fitness focused, it's definitely rooted in some of the fitness stuff that I've done over the past 12 years or so. It's actually probably been longer than 12. It's probably been closer to 14 now.
Really?
Yeah.
You're getting signal that it might even be more than that.
Yeah.
What's interesting is that's actually pretty close to the amount of time that I think I'm around 13, 14 years in the industry. So about the same time, but you are a little younger than me too. So I actually was even a later bloomer.
Were you really?
I think so.
How old were you when you started?
Well, I think I was turning 21. So I was overseas in Iraq, and I was 20 years old. I turned 21 on the way back. So I started when I was probably middle of the way through my 20th year. So.
Oh, wow. Yeah. I'm thinking 17, 18 for me.
Gotcha. Well, so also you have a little bit of a competitive background as well, and you have always had an interest in more the strength side of the house, it seems, right?
Yeah. For a long time, I spent many years doing strongman and powerlifting, and just general kind of strength has always kind of been the core of what I looked into, what I was trying to achieve in fitness. I tried doing the triathlon and things like that early on, and realized I was just always going to be a subpar runner, and the endurance thing was not really my forte. But I just had a natural knack for squatting, deadlifting. I wish I could say benching, but that would be a false statement.
Yeah, that's pretty cool though. I think not enough people have, or at least can accept a level of self-awareness where, just like you just said, where, essentially I am naturally suited a little bit over here versus over here. Some people just find themselves spinning their tires trying to be something
they're not.
Yeah.
Ain't that the truth?
Oh yeah, for sure. So we're going to get today's topic. We want to talk about functional training. Now, this probably is not going to be the only podcast episode where I'm going to talk about functional training, because my good buddy Mac, who is also a Savage coach here, he is really pro functional training, I would say. And we've been, him and I have had really great conversations where he's, kind of taken the stance of why functionality is a very relevant thing that should be appreciated. And so I do want to be careful not to necessarily, just completely shit on functional training in this episode. And I do think having him on is going to show another side of perspective. But what I wanted to kind of start the conversation by basically addressing, for those of you wondering, because this is a regular thing, functional training, really defining what that means, kind of getting into what a lot of fitness professionals, I think, frame it as, and whether or not it is, being kind of sold as something else. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because I think you really make a good point about just defining what it is first, because unfortunately, from my perspective, I've seen functional training get touted around. I've seen it come into form in like multiple manifestations, right? I've seen some people just refer to CrossFit as like functional training, and other people, functional training meant you're standing on a Bosu ball, and it had some sort of like just added instability or something like that, right? So I've seen a lot of different models of functional training and different ways that term is manifested into a program. So defining it would be important.
Yeah. And, I'll kind of start by giving what I think, the kind of the definition from my, stance is, and I think hearing your perspective is going to be good. Personally, I think that functionality is relative to what it is that you want to be better at. And so when you just, if we actually just, it's funny how we get really attached emotionally to particular definitions or words or things, we kind of make it into this polarized thing by, for instance, instead of saying just food, if you were to say McDonald's, you really already have an opinion attached to it versus just looking at, say, the macros or the nutrition that's a part of it, right? And I think in this case, functional training provokes an opinion already, kind of a societal opinion. But if we just said function by itself, you would just assume it's what is the thing doing. And so all functional training from my mind is training for whatever function it is that you're trying to get better at.
Yeah, agreed. I agree. I think that is probably the best, most broadest definition. Right. And then the question is, what are these clients, what are people trying to get better at? So what function? And I guess the question then is functional training different for every person? Because I might have a very different function that I want to be optimal at performing versus you.
Yeah. And, so the way that I bring it up in class is that if I had a power lifter, if somebody came to me and they wanted to do powerlifting, well, the squat, bench, and deadlift is a functional training for them. They are training for that specific function. Though the mainstream would not look at it as functional. They look at it as very rigid and kind of traditional lifting, if you will. So then what we have to do is we have to, we look at just kind of the broad scoped definition itself and say, okay, well, it is a function, but because it's one thing to say, okay, here's the definition of a term, but it's a whole nother conversation to say, what does society mean when they say it? What does the collective masses mean when they say it?
Yes. Yeah.
Because that's really what's affecting us, right? That's
really level. True. Yeah.
So, I've even heard things like I watched this whole, it was a podcast on like shit you should know or something like that. And we're talking about cuss words and how like most of them didn't really stem from the way that we take them now, like the original definition, but in the context of where we are now, it's a whole nother.
Yeah. It's taken on a different meaning, right?
Yeah. Well, so functional training nowadays, it seems to me, is attached to this whole like concept of, maybe like advanced movement patterns where you see a lot of dynamic range of motion and, I would say multi-plane kind of movements.
More complex in general movement patterns.
Yeah.
Right. Multi-plane.
Maybe a lot of unilateral type of like stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. And also the added instability of whatever implement they try to use to make it less stable.
Yeah. when you see this in what probably most of the time in what like your boot camps maybe, or your and I would even argue, like you said, like CrossFit, maybe kind of certain sports, maybe like kind of, you know, football and kind of that stuff is sometimes lumped in there with functional training, because you're doing a lot of rotational and lateral movements.
Right. Medicine ball throws and things like this. But for the most part, I would start from the standpoint, and again, this is coming from a strength guy, so maybe I'm biased, but I think that strength is probably the most functional aspect of fitness in the first place. And now, I wouldn't say that strength for sport necessarily is. Like, strength for sport to me is when you're training to become as strong in whatever lift you're doing, to be as strong in that as you humanly can. That's strength for sport. But strength in general, strength training, that's probably, to me, one of the most functional things you can do. If you want to increase your sprinting ability, then it's a combination of sprints and improving leg strength, right?
Yeah. So in a way, you're saying, so, you know, strength, just like functional training, is really a relative term to what it is that you're training for. And but if you were to look at the large categories of like fitness goals, you might say strong as a generalized statement is really, you know, overall functional for a human being. Like just being generally strong. Or being cardiorespiratory. We look at cardio actually as this kind of like big thing versus strength that seems to be a little different sometimes, you know?
Yeah. Well, I guess it just takes different stimulus to train your heart muscle, right? It takes a different stimulus to train that muscle and the rest of your cardiorespiratory system than it does to train the rest of your muscles. But
yeah, well, and so I guess this begs the question of like, let's say that we're looking at, say, a Camp Gladiator or something like that, okay? And we, or maybe let's frame it this way: somebody comes to us and they're saying, you know, I'm interested in potentially joining, say, a Camp Gladiator, and they're really selling. I don't know if this is the case. I don't mean to, you know, put words in Camp Gladiator's mouth, but let's say that they're selling them on, well, we take a more functional approach. We are more functional. And so that's like this big, you know, benefit. I guess, what would you say to that client? Like, how would we, you know, address that, you know, to kind of like, so that they can better understand?
How would you describe that?
Well, yeah, if they were asking your opinion, essentially, like, should I join Camp Gladiator? They say they're a more functional approach.
Right. This is to me where the conversation actually gets really interesting, because the definition of what is functional, again, would vary from individual to individual. And so I would tell most people this, that number one, start with being self-aware enough to know what you're trying to achieve. Before you drop money on training of any sort, just figure out what you want to achieve. What do you really like? What really inside you is making you want to do this? I think if more people were being honest with themselves, they would say, I want to look better. I want to look good naked. Like that's probably, honestly, I think less people care about the functional side of things than they really do about aesthetic. And that, to me, is where the conversation gets interesting, is, are you actually interested in some sort of function in life and getting better at that function? Because if not, then find a way just to, you know, just be honest with yourself and find somebody that's more suited to what your actual goals are, and be honest. I think a lot of people actually want to look really good, and they just think that maybe functional training is the best mode to get them there.
Yeah, no, yeah, you're absolutely right. And so this is kind of, we were talking about before we started recording, essentially kind of digging into this a little bit. And, you know, okay, I think you're absolutely right that most people, we can all be honest, are looking for some level of aesthetic goal. And I think I think that's a fair assessment if we're just being honest. Now, where I would have pushback, say from my buddy Mac, and they do, you know, boot camp formats, where I would have pushback is to say that, well, though that is true, it's my job to really kind of guide them towards the thing that maybe they don't know that they need, but they really need to be focused on, right? So it's kind of even Lane Norton, I think, has mentioned how he utilizes kind of the slightly deceive your client a little bit for the placebo effect to kind of take them somewhere where maybe they don't even realize, and so I get that. But even so, it's like, how far away do you get from their goal? You know what I mean? Like, because you technically weight loss, and we know this, weight loss, hypertrophy, they can be achieved in multiple different formats. And I'm not even suggesting that the bootcamp format is not effective. I think it can be effective. But there's also, like, if I use this example with Mac. I said, if we were being given the exact same person somehow, exact same person, so same genetics, all that stuff, and we went side by side and we said, all right, weight loss journey, go. And I go my approach, and then he goes his approach. I have a hard time believing that approach that he was taking would get there faster or as effective as what I am. Does that make sense?
I agree. I think that there's a more direct way in terms of aesthetics, right? In terms of fat loss, muscle gain. For those specific goals, I think there's a more direct approach. Yeah. I think that functional training, while it may be effective because you're still going to be burning calories in class, you're probably going to get close enough to fatigue and failure on certain muscle groups to actually achieve some hypertrophy, and you'll probably put them in a caloric deficit. And so you may be able to achieve whatever aesthetic goals you have through functional training, but I think that there's probably a more direct approach.
Right. And it's kind of, that gets into the old, where as much as you divide your attention, you're essentially, at some point you have to take away from a greater potential in one area. So, it's to say that the athlete coming up could have chosen 3 sports, but really needed to focus in on the one if he wanted to be the greatest at one. So that's where that specificity really kind of comes in a little bit. Now, it's not to say like and this is where I think there is an argument and really a subjectivity has to evolve, because the general fitness, the general hypertrophy, the general goal is it's not to such a specific that you're trying to be, the most shredded person on the planet or the strongest person on the planet or the most functional person on the planet. You kind of live in this open-endedness, I guess, to an extent. And so it is fair to say that I could have them, again, lose weight in lots of different fashions. But in my experience, I think, I guess, when somebody comes to me and they say, they want to lose weight, I believe that I can take a more traditional approach, still achieve lifestyle functionality while paying a little bit more coins into the goal of weight loss.
Yeah. And here's why I agree with you so much on that point, because I think the idea of functional training sets the bar really low. That's my biggest issue, is that if my goal is to just be functional for life, then I'm not really putting a big enough, more ambitious enough challenge in front of me to try to rise to that occasion. Instead, it's like, I want to be able to pick up my keys when I drop them on the floor, right? That's easy. It's a very, very low bar. And so saying that I want to lose 50 pounds and look jacked in a bathing suit, that's more ambitious. That's more difficult to achieve. And in the process of achieving that goal, you will inevitably do enough work to fill it. Like, you'll hit the functional part first, way before you get to that aesthetic goal, right? So I feel like just being functional for life is a low bar. Now, if the functionality that you're trying to achieve is something audacious, like I want to be if my interpretation of functional is to be able to run 100 miles in under 2 days or some crazy stuff like that, that to me is it's a different world, right? Yeah. That's why I think functional training is it's so ambiguous.
Well, okay, so I listened to this podcast that was, Naudi Aguilar. functional patterns is his business.
Yeah.
So, and he's one of these, I would say, over the top zealots about, functionality. And now he did it was supposed to be a debate, and I felt like it really was a flop in my opinion, but he was supposed to be doing a debate on his podcast with Brett Contreras, who of course is the glute guy.
Guy.
Yeah. And Brett comes from, I believe, more mine and your side of the house, where he's an academic and a researcher, but he definitely looks at this a more agnostic, I think, than most. Whereas Naughty is very tied to kind of the religion of functionality. Now, it was interesting listening because what I noticed is that the functional patterns model takes this very evolutionary approach. What they're saying is that we evolved to have, say, glutes the way that we do for the sake of running or sprinting, and kind of creating these hip movement patterns and all this stuff is really just, I guess, evolutionary advantageous to us, to our species, and that's where we need to focus versus where we try to train very rigid sagittally or whatever through extension and flexion, that we're taking away or we're regressing from that. What are your, first of all, what are your thoughts on that?
Oh man, I think that there's nothing wrong with introducing transverse plane movements, right? Going like you said, I think you're probably right that like it seems most bodybuilding is just like sagittal, but like incorporating more frontal and transverse plane movements, meaning more twisting in different angles and planes, there's nothing wrong with that inherently. But to me, you're just you're missing the real point, which is effort. More than anything, any mode that you choose of fitness is completely useless if you're not pushing yourself to like 90% of failure on a regular basis and continuing to push that week over week over week and continuing that effort. Now, if you do that effort in the sagittal plane only versus incorporating the transverse plane or not, has probably the tiniest little bit of impact on what your overall outcome is. So I guess my answer to your question then is that I'm more of that agnostic. I really like the way you described it, like the scientific kind of more agnostic viewpoint as opposed to like the really religious zealot.
Well, I think that I like the way Brett. I'd never heard this before. I felt like this was a crafty way to go to the other side of the argument because Naughty was saying that he essentially was trying to sell you on the fact that like because we evolved in such a way, our goal is to be the most, say, alpha or the most like I guess evolved version of ourselves and the strongest version of ourselves. So we need to do the thing that we essentially like evolved to do to pay into that. Now, what and that's the best for our species. Brett Contreras also said, yeah, but with evolution, another thing that we evolved to do was to reproduce, and so by building a more aesthetic physique, you're essentially encouraging a more sexually advantageous. Yeah, so I thought it was a unique take on that.
No, very nice. I like that.
Well, and so, anyway, it was an interesting back and forth, but I will say this is that, and this is the more that I get older in this and more I do this, I do, and I told Mac this, is I do think that there is quite a bit of functionality that I need to be open to incorporating more myself, because my bias is to go to a little bit more simplistic, I think, traditional style movements. Now, I'm good at functional anatomy. I teach this stuff for a living, and so I don't neglect planes of motion or particular, kind of movement patterns, but I don't really do a lot of, say, warm up mobility stuff or other assignment mobility kind of things. And I, prior to maybe the last few years, hadn't put as much attention into really dialing onto the mechanical proficiencies of just about anything I'm doing. You know what I mean? So like, I use the example of changing the tires on an out of a line car. But I think where I never really was able to latch on fully with the quote unquote functional crowd was that I do think that you need to learn how to be a badass at the squat and a badass at the deadlift. But I don't think that means that it's not functional. You know what I mean? I think that that's functional enough, I guess, for most people. If you can activate your hips like in a way that you can stabilize your pelvis through a full range of motion squat, that's enough for 90% of the population versus having to have them in some like awkward, say, contralateral, lunge, that's in multiple planes.
I really agree. I honestly think that the squat is complex enough, challenging enough, especially as you continually load it, that the gains that you make from learning how to squat really proficiently and being stronger at that carry over so much into other aspects of your life. Your balance improves. Your ability to go up the stairs improves. Everything down the line improves because it's such a hard and it's such a difficult thing to master. And in the process of doing so, you gain so much body awareness that really, again, I feel like the functional stuff is just such a it's such a low bar that along the way of doing anything else, powerlifting or bodybuilding or any like more, I guess I'm considering those upper level, more difficult challenges. Along the way, you will knock out functionality out of the park, and you will supersede that by a long shot.
Yeah, it's what I just realized was that the average boot camp or the average, say, kind of class in that format, like a Camp Gladiator, though you could say make an argument that it's quote unquote functional because you have them doing lots of dynamic movements and they're running and then they're laterally stepping and then they're doing up and down. But also one of the things that regularly is missed, and I don't want to speak collectively for everybody, but it's not like there's this periodization cycle to a very specific level. And so let's say that you did burpees in the beginning of the week, but you didn't do them again for 2 weeks after that. Well, even though you might say that, well, burpees are very functional because look what you have to do, up and down and all this body movement. Yeah, but you didn't spend enough time with them to actually create, initial adaptation to actually maintain that functionality.
Oh,
it's like riding your bike one time and then not revisiting again and wondering why you can't ride your bike again,
Dude, I think you just nailed it. You just nailed it because the biggest problem, the biggest problem with like the functional training idea, aside from the fact that it's kind of a low bar and it doesn't give you enough to challenge or aspire to, the other biggest problem is that if you have too much variety, then you don't have enough time to actually get better at it. You're right. One exposure to burpees every 3 or 4 weeks just doesn't do it. And if you have such a huge array of movements to incorporate, it's unlikely that you have enough frequency to be able to master it and really get great at it.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially in a class format, right? I mean, the level of attention that's and again, it sounds like I'm almost bashing classes. I'm not. I think that classes serve a reason. I think that the defense or why I would encourage somebody to go to a class or consider them has little to do with functionality, and it has everything to do with that particular type of format and community. I think is really good for a certain segment of the population. Yeah. I think that Susie that wants to lose, 15, 20 pounds, 30 pounds and has a hard time with discipline and motivation and is on a budget. I think that these are reasons why. Yeah, I think absolutely. But, and I told my mom this at one point. She was actually doing Camp Gladiator and she's really enjoying it and it was getting her back on track. But she then got kind of to the next level where she started tapping out those initial adaptations. And so, she's asking me and I'm like, well, now it's time to get specific. Yeah, I mean, you know what I mean? Like if you want to go somewhere else, if not, maintain that. Like you can hang out here and it's fun and you got, a community and it's a good time, but there's only so far you're going to travel until you have to start carving out your path to a more particular way. You know what I mean?
You need greater challenge. Again, it comes back to
greater and more specific challenge.
Yeah, more specific too. Yeah, those are the two issues I draw with functional training is you need a greater and more specific challenge, and that's what where it lacks. And I think a good point that you made though, that just so it doesn't seem like I'm just bashing on functional training, because I'm really not. That's not my intention here. One thing I will definitely give give credit where credit is due. One thing that functional training does well, and this is probably the most important thing in all of fitness, is it is a great way to keep people engaged for a longer period of time. Like I've just seen functional classes be very successful at pulling people in and they kind of create a community within it, and they just get sucked in and they want to do it over and over and over again. And that is one of those things that adherence is by far and away the most important part of all of this. And functional training seems to do a very good job at adherence.
Yeah, absolutely.
Got to give props.
I mean, even some of my favorite academics in this, like Eric Helms and his nutritional pyramid, he starts with calories and then goes macros, micros on up, to order of importance. Well, they added, a layer at the bottom of that's adherence. Because it's like, before we even go anywhere else, what can you, or what do you, kind of like, what's your goal and like what's realistic for you? And so, yeah, that motivation, those mental tactics, those kind of the sense of community, the branding, all that stuff, it's polarizing, and that polarization makes it to where you're more likely to fucking succeed,
Yeah, I agree.
You're inspired to succeed,
Yeah, I mean, it pulls people. It's a pack thing, people kind of rally into a pack in these Camp Gladiator or whatever. Like, they get very loyal to it, and they'll stick with it. And again, so adherence being, number one, they do that well.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool, man. Well, I think we are going to wrap up this episode. I am going to see if Dylan wants to stick around for recording another one, which we do have these podcasts coming out every single week. So we want to hear your thoughts down below in the comments, like what you think about functional trainers. Maybe you have experience or some sort of point of view or something that maybe we're missing. And I think we're always open to, changing our mind, or at least appreciating and adopting kind of another point of view. And so in the comments below, let us know. And that's it, man. Thanks for stopping by, bro.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks, guys. We'll talk to you later. Sweet.